Good morning. First and foremost, to those who may be joining us in person in the HASP classroom for the first time, welcome. We are so happy to have you here. Also, welcome to those joining via Zoom in the HASP virtual classroom. Next, you may recognize a new face in the HASP office. That is Amy Weber, our new office and project manager. She comes to us from the U.S. Department of Commerce, but has resided in Holland for 3 years. She and her family are movie buffs, and they love exploring the myriad of public events hosted in and around Holland. Please join us in welcoming Amy. Hi, Amy. This is the face. Never mind. Okay. Thank you, Amy. Lastly, as we approach a new month, we're happy to invite you to our monthly program hosted next Tuesday, October 4 at 9:30 at the Jack Miller Center for Musical Arts. The presentation is titled Saving Journalism and Democracy Even as Newspapers Die. Coffee and cookies will be served beginning at 9. Hope to see you there. Good morning. My name is Jan Dahlman. And we are blessed this morning to again have Joel Toppen as our presenter. This is a great decisions program featuring Myanmar and ASEAN. We'll talk about that. That means Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Joel is, this is the third time I've introduced Joel, and he was here before me. Joel is a professor at Hope. He is a political science prof, and he is chair of the department. He is celebrating 25 years at Hope, and he currently teaches U.S. foreign policy, global political economy, and intro to global politics. What I like about Joel is that he's innovative and experiential, and so he analyzes things and makes it understandable for us. He's also led groups to Japan, Rwanda, and 4 groups to DC. He's done research in African nations, including Mozambique, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda. He's also, if he doesn't have anything else to do, a consultant for international relief and development agencies. He's also a parent with kids in college, and I just learned he's teaching 3 classes this afternoon. So will you be kind in welcoming Joel? The other thing I need to always tell you is that he's Mary Toppen's son. I asked if I need to keep saying that, and she said, yes, please. Sure. Yes.
Thank you, Jan. So it was about 25 or so years ago when I first started teaching at Hope, when Rens Hooksma recruited me to the Great Decisions series. And some of you I know remember Rens, and we're part of the Great Decisions series here with HASP for years and years. And so the Foreign Policy Association each year does a Great Decisions series and produces these videos that are about 20 minutes long, trying to highlight some of the great decisions of U.S. foreign policy. And I'll get to that after we watch the video. It's a curious choice. Myanmar and ASEAN, certainly fascinating and interesting, and I'm glad to address the topic or topics, but I think it remains to be seen if it truly is a great decision, what we should do about Myanmar. So it's not US versus China, which, great powers, and that, how do we handle that foreign policy relationship? I think that certainly qualifies as a great decision. How does the US foreign policy, how do we relate or respond to the Russian invasion and war in Ukraine? That I think qualifies as a great decision. But what do we do about Myanmar? It's important. Every people is, everybody's important. But I'm not sure if it really gets to that level of great decision, maybe a big decision or an important decision. But 54 million people living in Myanmar, and certainly with the ongoing political unrest and ethnic persecution of Rohingya, there's some very compelling and important issues at stake. So when I play videos for my students, I usually can't help myself, and I will stop them in the middle and often and say, okay, this, right? And so I may do that here, but I'll try to wait as much as I can, have patience and let the video run. Just let them talk, let them, and then I'll give my 2 or 4 or 5 cents worth after the video.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022. Today we reach the midway point in this 9-lecture masterclass by turning our attention to topic number 5, Myanmar and ASEAN. ASEAN is a political and economic alliance in Southeast Asia. It today faces a great challenge in Myanmar, where a coup d'etat has installed a military dictatorship, and ASEAN has been called upon to address it. But the alliance's challenges are significantly more than internal, because the major power surrounding and to the north of ASEAN is the People's Republic of China. Here you can see Myanmar in red. It is on the western edge of the ASEAN Alliance, a very long border to the north and east with China. And this shows us the ASEAN Alliance and its 10 member states. China to the north has made significant claims to the South China Sea, well beyond that which is considered normal or acceptable under prevailing international law. And in many ways, not only China's military rise of late, but also its extended claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea have served to unify the ASEAN members against it. Before we can consider U.S. foreign policy options relating to Myanmar and ASEAN, we should first consider Myanmar itself, followed by the ASEAN Alliance, and then finally take into consideration the various regional dynamics at play as it relates to the crisis in Myanmar. First, we begin with Myanmar. As you can see, it was part of the old British Empire. At the time, the most dominant political force in the world, the United Kingdom in the 19th century and leading into World War I, had vast territorial claims across the international arena, including Burma, which is present-day Myanmar. Myanmar was occupied by the Japanese during World War II, and here you can see on the left-hand side a graph showing the amphibious landing and the penetration into Myanmar by Japanese military forces. There was a concerted Allied effort to take Myanmar back from Japan. The numbers. Myanmar became an independent, recognized nation in 1948. That puts it into the category of newly independent countries. It is roughly the size of the great state of Texas, with 57 million people, the vast majority of which are Burman, and the overwhelming majority in terms of religious belief are Buddhist. The per capita income of $5,142 is not very impressive. This is a poor country. In terms of ethnic groups, the dominant group would be the Burmans. You can see them in areas marked in white. Others, such as the Karen, the Chin, among others, are designated by color on this map. What is not shown are the Rohingya people. They are roughly 1 million in size, although the numbers vary greatly depending on one's source. They are Muslim, which sets them apart, and since 2016, they have been the subject of a genocide. The allegation of genocide, of course, is very significant, It is the targeting with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a person or people based upon any of a number of characteristics, including religion and ethnicity. So when the international community says genocide is happening in Myanmar, this is a serious allegation. As the violence has unfolded, the Rohingya have moved out of state, fled, as you can see from this graph, into neighboring countries, up to Bangladesh, but predominantly to Indonesia and Malaysia, creating a refugee crisis. On a separate note, Myanmar is also troubled by the fact that it is considered the world's meth lab, with significant amounts of illicit drugs being produced in country and shipped abroad. Let's take a look at the leadership of Myanmar since its independence in 1948. At that point, it was a monarchy. A king was in power. He was assassinated in 1962 when the military made a coup d'etat, taking power and keeping it throughout the Cold War and well into the 21st century. Democracy arrived in Myanmar in 2011. It lasted until 2021, when yet another coup d'etat occurred, returning the country to military leadership. Let's look at the democracy of Myanmar. Most people associate it with one person, Aung San Suu Kyi. She is the recipient of the 1991 Nobel Peace Prize because she was the leader of the resistance movement to the military. She was the face of the resistance, living under house arrest year after year. In 2015, she became the head of government. She could not assume the title of president or prime minister because that was expressly forbidden in the constitutional changes made back in 2011. The military clearly feared her. She has been, however, silent on the Rohingya genocide, at one point stating there's violence on both sides, which is a way of saying that, well, the Rohingya are being targeted, but for just reason. They have exhibited acts of violence, and the state of Myanmar is simply returning that violence upon them. The coup d'etat that took place in 2021 has its origins in the 2020 national election, the results of which were going to be certified in 2021 with a swearing-in ceremony. One day before that ceremony, the military made its move, arresting leaders who had been elected for a variety of offenses, including campaign law violations and violations of COVID measures in Myanmar. Over the course of the next month and a half, over 700 civilians were killed and more than 3,000 were detained. These numbers only increased throughout 2021. The ASEAN Alliance, the organization of states that should play a role in resolving the crisis in Myanmar. You can see from this graph, it is geographically located in Southeast Asia. It was established in 1967. Its membership has nearly doubled to 10 by 2022, and it promotes social, economic, and military cooperation among its member states. Its mission has evolved. Back in 1967, it was limited in membership largely because of its desire to counter neighboring Vietnam, the emerging power in Southeast Asia. It talked a great deal about multinational cooperation on a wide range of issues, which is, of course, its primary focus today as well. But in the mid-1990s, the mission of ASEAN changed to countering not Vietnam, but China, and for that reason, Vietnam was allowed to join the very organization that was created to counter its growth in power. Such is the nature of world politics. Alliances have one common problem relating to internal strife. So here we show a graph of a dominant power. It could be regional or international, and then a handful of smaller nations, each one of them vulnerable should the larger nation decide to invade it. for a matter of deterrence, they bind themselves together in a formal or informal alliance. An attack on one will be considered an attack upon all, and in so doing, they create a balance of power. Other nations, of course, can join if those who are currently members accept them, further strengthening the balance against the larger country. If, however, there is a problem within the alliance, such as Myanmar today, the tendency is to prioritize the original mission of the alliance, countering the large party, as opposed to dealing with problems inside of it. We saw this with NATO in 1974 when Turkey invaded Cyprus, and we're seeing it today with ASEAN addressing the crisis in Myanmar, simply sweeping it under the rug. The violence in Myanmar is significant. Undoubtedly, people are suffering, and the military coup has not been well received by the general public. It has caused people to leave their homes for safety, to flee across the nation and cross international boundaries. So let's now look at the regional dynamics at play. First, we'll start with ASEAN. How has it responded to the crisis in Myanmar? It issued what it called a 5-point consensus. All of the members of ASEAN agreed on 5 basic points, 3 of which are noteworthy. The call for a cessation of violence, appointment of a special envoy. An envoy is someone selected by a head of state, an organization, or an alliance to be the point person of communication, of contact, and negotiation on a particular issue. We, for example, have special envoys for countries, for regions, or even for themes. Myanmar, of course, a crisis within ASEAN, deserved a special envoy, someone who could speak between Myanmar and the ASEAN Alliance. And finally, ASEAN promoted humanitarian assistance to relieve the suffering of the people of Myanmar. There was, however, noteworthy, no call for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, who is back under house arrest. This is an example of sweeping a problem under the rug. This is not a strong action. This is not collective action with a specific intent, except to be able to publicly claim we're dealing with this issue and we've done all that we can do. Let's look at the influential actors in region. If we were to divide them into 3 categories, from most important and impacting at the top to least important and impacting at the bottom, ASEAN would go there, along with the United Nations. This is an alliance that has chosen not to get deeply involved and an organization that has very few options at its disposal. In our middle category of moderately influential countries, I would put Japan, the United States, the UK, and the European Union. Their economic power is substantial. If they decided in concert to economically punish those responsible for the coup in Myanmar, it would certainly have a significant impact. But at the very top is Australia. It is a regional power. It is one that has enormous influence in Southeast Asia and with Myanmar. So how has Australia responded to the coup? Forcefully or in a more reserved fashion? It is the latter, acting more like ASEAN in its response, which effectively takes Australia out of the calculation. So let's now look at American foreign policy options. First and foremost, we are a very great distance from Myanmar, more than 8,500 miles. Americans do not prioritize Myanmar. Very few are familiar with the situation that's happening in Southeast Asia, and the United States does not have a long history of investment or engagement in Myanmar. China, on the other hand, shares a common border with Myanmar that's more than 1,300 miles long. So clearly, among the major powers, China is the most influential. Let's take a look then at China. The most influential actor, the leader of that region, a country that is deeply concerned about the anti-China sentiment that is bubbling over in Myanmar. Many in the resistance movement, in the general public, believe that China was behind the 2021 coup d'etat, that it gave a green light because it preferred the military leadership over the elected leadership of Myanmar. There has been a spike in anti-China crime, and that will likely continue, given the sentiment of the people of Myanmar. China is also very concerned about an explosion of COVID on that long common border. After all, if people are out protesting, if they're congregating in large areas, that is a recipe for COVID expansion, and that is not what China wants. And finally, China has to be concerned about the economic corridor that it has established through Myanmar that could be jeopardized by violence in the country. China has tended to prefer elected officials in countries that it deals with. The reason for that is rather straightforward. When China approaches a country about economic engagement, it tends to ask, what do your people need? If it's light rail or a port system, if it's telecommunications, if it's a psychiatric ward or a rum factory. I mean, the whole range of options the Chinese are going to provide it, either through long-term low-interest loans, technical supports, or state-to-state grants. And what the Chinese are doing are building strong relations with publics, with the various members of the public of the countries they engage. And so they're concerned about a coup d'etat that they are going to be blamed for, whether or not they had a role to play in it. Here you can see the economic corridor. It is part of the much larger Chinese design on global economic expansion. It runs through Myanmar on its way to Bangladesh and India. The U.S. relations with Myanmar have risen and fallen, falling during the time of the late military leadership in the early 2000s, rising significantly when democracy arrived in 2011, and then tapering off with the recent coup d'etat. The underlying context of American foreign policy calculations, we don't have any vital interests that are at risk in Myanmar. A military response is extraordinarily unlikely, in part because of the region and our experience in Vietnam, but more importantly because there probably isn't a military solution to Myanmar, and certainly not one that we would pursue. Economic blockades, cyber attacks are probably out, a bit over the top. Targeted economic sanctions make a lot of sense, raising the cost of those who committed the act of the coup. But we're certainly not going to be willing to attach America's reputation to what happens ultimately in Myanmar. We've been burned in this country before. The Obama administration invested a great deal of energy and attention towards Myanmar. You can see Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in-country visit. When the military decided that it would allow for a peaceful transition of power, we took away our economic sanctions and upgraded our diplomatic presence in the country. So the Obama administration was invested in turning Myanmar from a military government to a democracy in hopes of aligning with it as part of his pivot towards Asia. We've now been burned to some extent by the 2021 coup. So what exactly is our foreign policy path? Well, we should probably act in concert with other major powers, including the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, Australia, perhaps India. India could be an amazingly influential power if it wanted to in Myanmar. To date, it has not indicated a willingness to do so. A lot of risk for India. It is reluctant to attach its reputation to the outcome of this coup d'etat. Targeted economic sanctions, targeted travel sanctions, and targeted social sanctions could all be employed by these major economic powers against those responsible for the military coup. Probably not going to result in any significant change, given that most of those in charge in Burma are deeply invested in their country and in the government that they now are controlling. We will very likely pursue a policy of some suspended aid. We do want to be careful here because much of the aid that we send to Myanmar, even though it's channeled through government offices, makes its way to the people of the country. There is the reality of aid leakage. Anytime that we make a donation to a targeted group within a country, it is going to be distributed by the national government and state institutions. Along the way, people will take a cut. We lose anywhere from 10 to 40% of targeted aid because of this phenomenon of leakage. And while many people argue that we should probably stop donating if the aid is going to be siphoned off into deep pockets, as the most generous country in the world, the United States probably does not want to raise the expectation level so high on aid delivery. There's just a simple reality that it is the cost of doing business. So if we are going to suspend aid, we have to be very careful such that we don't punish the very people of Myanmar who we are trying to assist. We can also dangle some carrots in front of the military leadership of Myanmar. There are things that they want and that we can offer. It would take some direct communication to clearly identify them and then set the conditions for those rewards being offered. I'm not sure at all that we can be willing to offer enough to make any sort of transition back to democracy possible in Myanmar. The violence continues. The protests go on unabated. The body bags, of course, are piling up. We should think about broadening the focus beyond just Myanmar. I mean, that is the crisis. That is the focus of this great decisions topic, but so is the alliance that surrounds it, that includes Myanmar. So let's take a look at the ASEAN Alliance and America's relationship with it. In 2021, ASEAN held its annual summit. President Biden was invited and he did attend. He made a $100 million pledge in aid to ASEAN members. This aid was designed to support health care spending, promote the climate initiative, education, and economic recovery in the post-COVID era. We spoke in an earlier lecture about the 3 levels of foreign policy challenges that we can place great decisions topics in. At the highest level are existential threats, the ones that alter the trajectory of history. Then there are the routine high politics issues that occupy easily 90% of our foreign policy makers' time, energy, and planning. And then finally are the low politics, promotion of democracy abroad, engaging with smaller powers, and promoting human rights and dignity. It is not to say that low politics don't matter, but it is to say foreign policy makers look at them as tertiary concerns. Myanmar falls in that category. It is a small power. We're dealing with issues of democracy and human rights. It is not on the front burner of the Biden administration. I want to thank you for attending this lecture, encourage you to stay engaged and make great decisions.
The professor kind of made my point there, saying that Myanmar falls in a tertiary or kind of third-rate category. So kind of saying it's not really a great, decision in terms of the significance. I want to thank Jan and Ian and the others and all of you for having me again and for extending the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak with HASP. I do want to offer a caveat. Jan had some real nice, kind words to say, but it should have become clear that I am not a Southeast Asian specialist by any stretch. I my dissertation for my PhD dealt with U.S. foreign policy. I do teach U.S. foreign policy, so I'm a expert, I guess, in international relations and issues of global security and security studies and U.S. foreign policy, but I'm not a Burmese or Myanmar specialist or Southeast Asian specialist. So I'll put it as the film did, and the professor there put it in the context of U.S. foreign policy more generally. And then also, if there are questions along the way, I'm pretty loose in terms of, not very formal in terms of presentation. So if there are questions that pop up along the way, I'm fully comfortable with what otherwise might seem as an interruption, but that's there are no interruptions. So please feel free, and we might have some online questions that come along the way. So the first thing that I want to stress in terms of the big picture, Myanmar it's a small power, as it was said, but 57 million people, that's not very small. It's one of the, it's larger than most countries in the world. We have 193 member states of the United Nations, so it's well in the top tier in terms of population. But in and of itself, as was suggested, what are U.S. foreign policy interests? What is in it for the United States? Another way to put that perhaps is, why do we in the U.S. care about Myanmar and what is happening there? And first and foremost, this was mentioned a bit, but I want to highlight it more, and that is the relationship of the United States with China. And so the U.S.-China great power competition, whereas Myanmar is a small power, but great power competition is what is the broader context. And of course, the United States facing a challenger to its position of global hegemony from China. So China is a rising power, what we call a rising power. Question, is this the new Cold War? Is this what we're seeing here? Where we had during the original Cold War, the United States and its mostly democratic allies faced off against the Soviet Union and its mostly communist allies. And it was a Cold War because it wasn't hot, right? That the US didn't engage the Soviet Union in warfare directly. So that's what we mean when we say that it was a Cold War. Of course, there was plenty of hot war during the Cold War. But these were usually fought through proxies, or we had proxy wars. So the United States would support one side, the Soviet Union would support another side, and it wasn't a direct conflict, but we had this kind of proxy war. And so much of the rest of the world got stuck in between these two great powers that were competing for security and influence and power globally with each other. So you had kind of smaller countries that essentially were pawns in this great power game or this great power conflict. And we can certainly see the possibility of that, a similar phenomenon here with Myanmar. So the United States is concerned about Myanmar. Why? What is the interest? As was said, there's no vital U.S. interests at stake. We don't get most of our oil from Myanmar, or most of our chips or needed technology. There's not this vital interest at stake. But so largely the relationship is dominated by our position vis-a-vis China in this kind of great power conflict. Now, an aside, and maybe you have heard this mentioned before, maybe even I have mentioned it before in a previous talk to you all, but the Thucydides Trap is a concept that I want to highlight here. The Thucydides Trap. So the ancient Greek historian Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian War and Athens versus Sparta, and many realist scholars that subscribe to a theory of global politics or of international relations relations that they call realism, rather than being idealistic or wishing the world would work a certain way. The realists say, no, it's about we might wish that we had this kind of world where we all got along and it was peace and harmony, but the real world is different. And in the real world, we have this competition for power and security between nation states. And it's been that way since the ancient days. And so Athens and Sparta, you have a reigning power, a established power, and then a rising power, and challenging the dominant position or the hegemony of the established power. And that's what we have today. Many realists would say, with the US as the established global superpower and China as a rising power with this incredible economic growth and military expansion as well, especially since 1980. And China is able to challenge the US position. Now, historians and scholars have gone back through time, through human history, and they've counted up how many times has this occurred, where you have this established global superpower, hegemon, and then a rising, challenging power coming up. And Graham Allison wrote this book called recently, excuse me, called Destined for War. And the subtitle is, Can the US and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? And so he goes, in his research team, they go back and through history, they identify 16 different times that this has occurred, where we have a established power being challenged by a rising power. 16 times this has happened, and 12 of those 16 times, the great powers have gone to war against each other. So some 75% of the time. And so this is why Allison and others referred to this situation as a trap, Thucydides trap. The logic of this power competition would lead us to expect war between these great powers. So moving through the 21st century, this is a great decision or a great issue. How can we avoid this great power war? Are we marching kind of almost perhaps blindly toward this? Well, we have to be tough on China. We've got to stand up to China. We have to challenge their rise. We have to limit China's power in this competition. Or is that just, that's kind of playing into the trap? That mindset is, we're falling into this trap. And China, if they are their decision makers are thinking in a similar way, that we want to take on the United States, we want to replace the United States as being the world's dominant hegemon, then the logic of that competition doesn't necessarily lead to somewhere peaceful. And we might be marching towards the cliff of this trap. So I want to, that broader context, I think, is very important. And also, as the short film mentioned and identified, that ASEAN gets its start. It's an alliance, cultural, political, economic, and military, these 10 nations of Southeast Asia, and originally formed to check or counter the rise of Vietnam as a potential regional hegemon, not a global hegemon. Vietnam was not about to take over the world or pose a threat to US interests in Latin America or in Europe. No, but regionally, Vietnam was a security threat to the interests of the ASEAN countries. So they then form this alliance and come together to balance the rising power of Vietnam. And then, of course, as it was mentioned, now it's no longer Vietnam that is the common threat or risk to the interests of these countries, but of course, the rise of China and the power of China in this regional domination. So one of the things that I think is interesting about this case is that ASEAN it's what we call an intergovernmental organization, or an IGO, sometimes called an IO, these multilateral institutions. So we have, like, the United Nations, the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Those are global institutions, IGOs, which are non-state actors. So our main actors or players in the game of global politics are nation states. And of course, in international relations, when we say state, we're not saying Indiana or Michigan, right? We mean a nation state or country. So that can be sometimes confusing for my students when they say states are the central actors or players. So we're talking about nation states, but we also have, of course, important non-state actors. And IGOs are an important category of non-state actor. So the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court, NATO is also an IGO. And they could be regional or they can be global. ASEAN is a regional IGO, so somewhat like the European Union or the Organization of American States or the Arab League or the African Union. These are regional associations. And so it's an interesting question. Are IGOs really that important? Or are they mostly irrelevant? Right. So the United Nations, or ASEAN itself. Okay, the title is Myanmar and ASEAN, but some critics, realists might say, ASEAN really is not a non-factor in this. Just as the UN, they issue a report. They say, oh, there have been atrocious human rights violations against Rohingyas. There's genocide. They use the G word even. But okay, does that really matter? There's not apparently much will to do anything about that. Okay, we have genocide. And we often, when we talk about genocide, sometimes, at least in the United States, we hear this phrase, never again, right? Never again until the next genocide, where we look away. And then we say never again. And then the next genocide occurs and we say never again and we look away. So does it really matter? Right? The international law, international organizations, the United Nations, ASEAN, maybe it's just talk, right? Or pieces of paper that they say, oh, we passed a resolution, you can't do that or you shouldn't do that, but there's no power behind it. And so realists would say that essentially international law, international organizations are on the sidelines. They exist. Realists recognize that, ASEAN exists, international law exists, but how much significance does it have? How much power does it have? And realists would say not much, that these IGOs are somewhat on the sidelines, they're somewhat irrelevant. Now, nationalists, as opposed to realists, nationalists in the United States and throughout Europe, and throughout the world, we can look at the nationalist agenda of a Bolsonaro in Brazil, of Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are nationalists who fear that international organizations and international law will usurp and destroy national sovereignty. So they are not saying that, oh, these IOs, these international organizations, groups like the EU, like ASEAN, the United Nations, WTO, they say, no, we're actually afraid or have some concern that they are powerful, that they do matter. And how, if the more and more power that these international organizations have, the more influence, the more control that they have over nation states, then those nation states are losing their independence, their independent autonomy, or what we call sovereignty. That nation states are losing their sovereignty and they doing what they want, controlling their own policies, controlling their own destiny, and they have to abide by or listen to the law or rulings of a higher authority above the level of nation state. So in the case of the European Union, for example, Viktor Orban is a nationalist in Hungary, and he's saying, no, we in Hungary will decide our policies. We don't want our political system, our political policies to be determined or to be dictated to us from Brussels or from a higher level of outside of Hungary at the European Union level. So there's this great tension and struggle now we've seen with Hungary. They're still part of the European Union, but they want to preserve that sovereignty, and they're fearful that these international organizations are going to usurp sovereignty and essentially eventually destroy it. Now, of course, the British were fearful of this as well. So the British in 2016, of course, voted to leave the European Union, voted for Brexit, and said, we are going to, maybe there are some advantages, primarily economic advantages, to being in this union, the European Union. But we're willing to forfeit those economic advantages because we want to reclaim and reestablish our national sovereignty. We're not going to give that up. We're going to decide our policies. We're not going to forfeit those decisions to a higher authority or to a bureaucrat in Brussels or somewhere outside of the UK. So that's also part of the bigger picture as we think about international organizations. Now, transnational issues. So on the one side, you could say, well, really, it's about power and security, this competition between nation states, between countries. And so these IOs, these IGOs, essentially irrelevant. Right? That's not the main game of global politics. It's kind of on the sidelines. On the other hand, you have nationalists who fear that, no, they actually are important players. They actually are powerful, and that's a danger, because they're limiting nation states' ability to handle their own affairs. So it's a threat to sovereignty. And then on the other hand, you have folks who say, well, in the 21st century, the problems that we have are transnational. So the problems that we have, that we face, the threats to national security, to foreign policy interests, the threats are largely transnational. By definition, they cross borders. Now, the threat that we see in Myanmar is an internal matter. It's not a transnational matter. Now, particularly the political unrest, the civil war, the nascent civil war or ongoing civil war, this competition for power for the government of Myanmar, that's an internal matter. But when Rohingya are persecuted, that's an internal matter until we have a refugee crisis. Right? So Malaysia is dealing with hundreds of thousands of refugees. Now that's a transnational matter, right? The refugees have crossed borders. So IGOs, some would say, are essential to addressing effectively these transnational issues. So what transnational issues? COVID-19. Right. COVID does not respect borders, right? COVID doesn't stop at a passport office and say, oh, nope, you're not allowed to cross this border, stop, right? So it's by definition, by its nature, it is a transnational issue. It crosses across borders. So it's a common threat for nation states. Climate change, it would be another, right? By definition, it's not within borders. It doesn't respect borders. So the change to the climate and the threat of environmental catastrophe, we're seeing these, the floods in Pakistan, for example, where a third of the country is underwater. That is an existential threat, but it's climate. The problem with climate is this kind of classic transnational issue. And so if you have the increasing saliency of transnational issues, so say maybe 200 years ago, we didn't have as much globalization, we didn't have as much cross-border flow of goods, of services, of people, of money crossing borders. Now, the age of globalization, we have tremendous cross-border flows of all different kinds. And so then that leads to the increasing significance or importance of transnational issues that issues are not just contained within a country and each country says, okay, we're going to deal with our problems, you deal with your problems. The idea is that increasingly the problems are shared across borders. So if that is the reality, that we have the increased importance, significance of these transnational issues, these are the real threats, right? The threats to US national security may become in the form of global disease, come in the form of global climate change. These are not state threats, nation states. So the US, say, for our foreign policy, we also face threats from nation states, right? China is a threat. Russia is a nation state that is threatening to the US interests. Iran, North Korea. Okay, that's kind of the traditional realist way of thinking of states versus states. But what if the main threats, the most significant threats are not coming from nation states? They're coming from global disease, from climate change, these transnational threats. Well, in that case, then, if we have transnational problems, then the promoters of international organizations, sometimes we call these folks liberal internationalists or liberals as it relates to global politics, they would say, if we have transnational problems, transnational issues, transnational threats, then we need a transnational approach to addressing these problems. And so we have international laws and we have international organizations, multilateral institutions, because the threats that we face are multilateral or are transnational. And so again, though then we have, maybe there's some logic to that. So the folks promoting international organizations or international law are not necessarily globalists. They're not necessarily saying, hey, we should put aside our national identities and we should become citizens of the world and we should become globalists and we're one human family, and this nationalism and these national identities stand in the way of our realizing our common purposes and our common interests. The promoters of international organizations they can be, and many of them are globalists in that sense, but you don't have to be. They're maybe just pragmatists. They're saying, look, the reality is we have these transnational threats. And so it makes sense that we respond to these threats and concerns, problems in a transnational way. And so that's why we join together in these organizations like ASEAN or the United Nations, et cetera. Okay, so also I want to highlight the distinction between globalization and regionalization. So at one point in the short video, the professor was making the distinction between a regional organization like ASEAN or an international organization. And I just want to clarify a bit because that's confusing. So ASEAN is international, right? Because it involves more than one nation. So that means it's international. And we have 10 nations in ASEAN. But what he meant to say, I think what he should have said is regional versus national. So ASEAN is a regional international organization. It's not a global international organization, but it's an association obviously among nations, a nation state. So it is certainly international. But so the trend of globalization, that the world is shrinking, it's becoming one place, right? And so maybe we're leading, nationalists might fear, to a global government eventually, where national identity is threatened or perhaps even destroyed with this globalization. The World Trade Organization has more power. The United Nations maybe has more power. The International Criminal Court has more power to go after individuals in nation states. But maybe a better way to think about it is regionalization. So we're seeing increase and continued increase of cross-border flows, but it's not that, as Tom Friedman famously said, it's not that the world is flat, right? That we're just one big platform and one big planet, and you know, if you want a good delivered to your house, you go online, and it doesn't really matter where it's coming from. If it's coming from China, if it's coming from South Africa, You know, you push the button and 2 days later or whatever, it arrives on your doorstep. Right? And so that is the idea of a globalized, flat world where we're all part of this single entity. But maybe that's not what's happening. Maybe it's more we're moving toward an age of regionalization. So cross-border flows, yes, trade moving across borders, people moving across borders, finance moving across borders, yes, 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 but it's not in a global fashion. It's more in a regional fashion. And especially as we see the world's response to the COVID-19 crisis and economic recession, short-lived, thankfully, in the US at least, maybe we're coming back into one, the threats to global supply chains. And we're saying, ooh, maybe we don't want to be dependent upon a global supply chain. And so maybe we want to bring things closer to home and not be so globalized. Maybe not domestic production necessarily, but what's called nearshoring. So instead of offshoring, you get goods and services and part of your supply chain comes from all over the world. Not offshore, but near shore. So we want to not be dependent on a global supply chain, but a regional, maybe, supply chain in terms of economics. And so we're seeing this regionalization. So this is a fascinating question because as we move through the 21st century, are we moving into a new era of a Cold War? Right, that during the 1940s, the US and the Soviet Union, we were entering this period of a Cold War. Is that what we're facing here in the 21st century? It's the United States and China. And this is what we would call a bipolar system, right? So it's not unipolar, it's bipolar, the two major poles of power, and then the other nation states are drawn to those poles of power. So during the Cold War, classic bipolar system that we had. And then when the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union falls apart and it is no longer a superpower, then we had this era of a unipolar moment, a unipolar period of time where the US was the sole superpower of the world. And what are we entering into now? Maybe it's a return of a bipolar system where the US and China are the two major world powers that are pitted against each other. But maybe more accurately, we're entering into a multipolar world where we have many centers or poles of power. So say, yes, the United States, certainly, China, certainly, but Europe. Right? And Europe not necessarily so closely aligned with the United States anymore. And so Emmanuel Macron in France talking about we maybe need some strategic autonomy from the United States. So we still agree with the US, we're still in NATO with the US, but we're going to kind of go our own way and have our own foreign policy or our own strategic approach to the problems of the 21st century. And then perhaps India, of course, with a billion 0.4 people, that maybe that is also another center of power. Maybe we'll see the nation states of Latin America coalescing and working together to form a lesser power or a pole, but again, another serious actor in a multipolar system. Now, most scholars of international politics would say that a multipolar system is more unstable, and that leads to there are more competition dynamics, and there's more opportunity for conflict and for war, and that a bipolar system is relatively stable, right? That you have these two major powers kind of pitted against each other. They have a balance of power, and the system itself is stable, and we can avoid a great power war like we did during the Cold War. But that a multipolar system is essentially more unstable and more likely to lead to conflict. So, and it's interesting with the US, so the issue is China, Myanmar is significant for the United States in terms of foreign policy, largely through the lens or through the issue of China and containing China's rise to power. But also, what are U.S. interests? And this is interesting, right? You put it way at the bottom, these low politics. So high politics, realist scholars have always said high politics, that's the important stuff, right? War, basically, and competition for power and security. And are we going to have a nuclear arms deal? Or, that is high politics. And then these lower order issues, they're there, but they're really not that important. So the professor in the film said, that is not to say that these are unimportant, but I'm putting them at the bottom of this hierarchy and I'm calling them low politics. So, he can say that doesn't mean necessarily they're not important, but he's kind of saying that they're not as important as the high politics issues. So the low politics, the U.S., I would argue, does have an interest in democracy and in human rights. So for many realist scholars, they say, okay, yeah, I like human rights, I like democracy, just like, I like rainbows and lollipops and puppies. These are good things, but it's not the basis of U.S. foreign policy. Right? U.S. foreign policy should be grounded in understanding of U.S. national security interests. That's what U.S. foreign policy should be about, and not about promoting lollipops or puppies or human rights or all these other good things that we like. All these good things, yes, they're good things, but maybe not central, and that's not the real substance of U.S. national security. Others, of course, would say that the promotion of human rights, the promotion of democracy abroad, overseas, in Myanmar, in Ukraine, that is fundamentally connected to U.S. national security interests. It is our self-interest. So when we talk about aid or humanitarian assistance or promotion of human rights for the Rohingya minority, maybe it's not altruistic. It's not that, we're helping them, or we're concerned about their interests. No, right? Liberals might say, or liberal internationalists might make the argument that it's in the U.S. self-interest to promote democracy in Ukraine, in Burma, and indeed around the world. As it relates to international law, I'm going to wrap up here. I have several more points to make and material to go over, but I want to make sure we have time for conversation and discussion and questions, etc. But I wanted to make the point also about the ethnic conflict that we see in Myanmar. So some 100, the diversity that we see in Myanmar is immense. So they have some 100 different ethnic groups. So when in the United States, sometimes when we think about ethnic conflict or ethnic divides, sometimes it's just as simple as blacks and whites, right? Two groups, right? And obviously the ethnic makeup of the United States is much more complicated than that. But like it is in Myanmar. So we have a majority population that makes up about 2/3 of the population, but up to 100 different ethnic groups. And so sometimes the matching up of nation and state, nation being the people, right, the people group, and the state being the government or the political system, sometimes the matching up of those is real simple and straightforward and kind of easy. And with my students, I refer to Japan as an example. So Japan, you have this limited territory and you have largely Japanese people, 90 whatever. They do have ethnic minorities in Japan, but very limited in terms of the overall population. So you have some 90 whatever percent Japanese, and then that's the nation, the people group, and then you match that up with the state or the government of Japan. And it's pretty simple and straightforward. But in a lot of places, you have multi-ethnic states or multinational states. So in Myanmar, you have some 100 different ethnic groups or different people groups, or sometimes we call them different nations. And so the matching up can be pretty difficult, right? Where the majority group might say, Burma for Burmese, and you, Rohingya, you're not us. So you don't have a home here. And so we're going to repress your political voice, and we're going to encourage you to actually go elsewhere. And the matching up of nation state is not so simple. Iraq is another example, right? So you have the state of Iraq, the government, but the people groups, you have three, again, many different nations or nationalities or ethnic groups, people groups in Iraq, but three major ones, the Sunni and the Shia, and then, of course, Kurds in Iraq. And so how do you have these three nations? Maybe they should have three different states. Maybe the Kurds, instead of trying to get along and figure out how to share power with these three major groups, maybe they should divide and say, Kurds, you get your own country, right? The Shia majority, you get your own country. Sunni minority, they get their own country. Somewhat maybe more like the Israel-Palestine model, where you have these two people groups, two nations, but only one piece of land. And so do we want a one-state solution where we all live together under one government in a multinational state? Or do we say, no, we're going to separate, and you get your state, and this people group, they get their state, and we go our separate ways. So that's also part of the analysis that undergirds the understanding of the politics of Myanmar in terms of its ethnic divides and its ethnic conflicts. Now, when it comes to ethnic divides and ethnic conflicts, the region around, they have an interest in stability. Right? So if there's a refugee crisis in Myanmar, it becomes Thailand's problem, it becomes Malaysia's problem. It's not just contained in country in Myanmar. So it becomes a regional problem. But the other point that I want to make when it comes to this ethnic conflict is that the region can provide incentives or interest to resolve these difficulties so that they indeed remain contained within the nation state and within Myanmar in this case, and don't lead to a refugee crisis. Now, and one final point, and then I'll open it up. So the international community has promoted this concept called R2P, the responsibility to protect. And it's an international legal concept that was made up, right? So 100 years ago, we didn't have the responsibility to protect. Maybe it existed, but it wasn't named. It wasn't a thing, this concept, R2P. And so the idea is that certainly nation states are responsible for the well-being of their own citizens. But if that nation state fails to protect the human rights of its own citizens, then the international community has a responsibility to go in and to protect the rights of those citizens. And this is the concept of R2P. So it threatens, for some people, the concept of R2P is a threat to national sovereignty, because a nation state says is not just in control of its own borders, that the outside international community is saying, we have a responsibility to protect the human rights of Rohingya Muslims if the government of Myanmar is not doing that. Right. So it invites, for some, it invites then this violation of sovereignty where the international community can come in, not just can come in, but actually has a responsibility to come in from outside and protect the rights of civilians. So Jan has a microphone. Do we have questions online? Do we have questions here in the class or comments, thoughts?
We do have a question online. Let me grab it here. All right, so this was from Ben Hancock. Should we be concerned about the growing trend of the rise of the authoritarian regimes around the world, sometimes replacing democratic governments? Are there lessons here for the U.S.?
Yeah, definitely. The great question. The concern of the rise of authoritarianism. So, and this is the bigger picture about democracy and the future of democracy globally, not just in the United States. So if we go back 200 years ago, how many democracies were there in the world in 1822? Right. And of course, the answer to that question depends upon your definition of democracy. So the United States, for example, we might say, well, the US was a democracy. Of course, by today's definitions, if we looked at a country today that they had widespread slavery, women were not allowed the right to vote, racial minorities were effectively excluded from the franchise. If we looked at a country that fit those boxes or had those characteristics today, we might say, yeah, I don't think that really counts as a democracy, right? But depending on the definition, we had maybe 0 democracies in the world in 1822, or maybe the US counts and maybe the UK would count, but we just had a handful or very few. And in 200 years of human history, this is really amazing to me, difficult for me to get my head around it. In 200 years of human history, we went from basically no nation state level democracies in the world to a majority. So today, we've had some backsliding in the 21st century in terms of the democracy agenda or the spread of democracy in Hungary, in Brazil. In some of these cases, I've mentioned that Turkey is another one, right, where we've seen democratic backsliding. But for 200 years, really, I mean, there's some waves of democratization, but it's been pretty consistent trend of basically no democracies in the world to a world where it's the norm, where most countries are democratic to a certain extent, and most people on the planet live in some sort of democracy or another. And so this is a big picture question. Is this inexorable? Is this trend, is there a destiny to human history? Is there a direction that history is moving in? Or is it just completely haphazard and it could go this way, it could go that way? And so some are really concerned that no, the spread of democracy and the continued spread of democracy around the world is not inexorable. There's nothing inevitable about it. It's at risk, it's fragile, and this could represent a case, right? Maybe a small case, not the most important case, but a case in which we're seeing this democratic backsliding, and we're seeing the rise of authoritarians with Russia, with China, with North Korea, with Iran. Interesting images over the weekend coming from Iran with protests in the street. Like, whoa, we usually don't see that so much. So maybe there's hope for democracy in Iran even. But yes, that's certainly a great question to put it in this perspective of the threat, not just of autocracies, but the threat of authoritarianism. Right. So it's not just the threat that China poses or that Xi poses, but the threat really is the idea of authoritarianism. And if the people of the world look at democracies and say, like the US, and say, democracy, it doesn't seem to be working out so well. Right. They're not handling crises very well. Democracy is fraught. Maybe we want to follow the China model rather than the democratic model. So that's certainly a bigger picture context of this story. And so, yes, I like liberal internationalists, I think that there is an interest that the US has in promoting democracy globally and promoting democracy, not just in the US, but around. And it's not to make sure that other countries are become like us, or we're trying to, recreate the world in our own image, or we have some sort of mission like that. But the US security interests are advanced if democracy is promoted and healthy abroad. So the threats that the US faces, the national security threats that come from countries, come from nation states, China, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran. These are all non-democratic states. And so that's not just a coincidence there. That's not just an accident, right? So if we can promote democracy in other places, then we will have fewer risks to US national security interests. Yes. Jan, there's a question over here. No.
Italy's last election just recently has put in as somebody they're comparing to Mussolini's genre. So wondering about that.
Yeah, and we're seeing the kind of the rise or the return of the right. I don't know much about the particular candidate and party in Italy, but many analysts and scholars have referred to it as neo-fascists. Of course, the leader Meloni, she's saying, no. I'm not a fascist. Just relax, right? But for some, they say the positions, particularly the anti-immigration position, reminds some of the fascist era. The far right had some success in Sweden recently, also the elections there. And so, yeah, it's hard to say if this represents, for some on the left, of course, this represents a threat to democracy. That democracy is under threat, not just in places like Myanmar or far off places in the global south, but democracy is under threat in Italy now, in Sweden, in the United States, even. And others would say, this is just kind of the normal ebb and flow. The pendulum kind of goes to the right and goes to the left. And so they have elected a right-wing coalition government, and it's not a threat to democracy, like just relax. But, it's like threats to democracy, it's not a threat to democracy until it is a threat to democracy. Then, it's like all these security concerns or security threats. They're not a problem until potentially, then they are a problem. But yes, great to put that into context.
While I'm going, I was noted that China approaches countries to say, what do you need? Do we do that?
That's a great question. So, the question that China looks at the needs of other countries and tries to meet those needs, and maybe the United States would be better off with a better pair of ears rather than telling countries this is what you need, but to listen to those expressed needs. But I mean, make no mistake, China is pursuing China's interests, right? And so the way they're providing Myanmar with what they need so that China's role and influence and power is advanced. They're not altruistic. They're not acting in the interests of others. They're acting in its own self-interest. And if that was an important question, because we talk about aid, right? This aid or assistance, we're helping, and U.S. voters are reluctant to support foreign aid, right? But we're not reluctant to support a $1 trillion nearly a year defense budget, right? We're willing to spend money for national security, $800 billion every single year for our defense budget, because we're willing to spend that because it's for us. It's for defense. It's for our interests. And then when people say, oh, foreign aid, as if it's not in our interests. And I think the whole debate about and the whole issue of foreign aid needs to be reframed. If you want to increase support for a foreign aid budget, don't call it aid. Right? Why are we giving money to people around the world? For us. We're not doing, it's not a gift. We're trying to advance our own interests. And if we framed it that way, I think there would be greater domestic political support for advancing our own interests. But when it's framed in terms of putting other interests first or helping others, aiding them, assisting them, then that's when we go, well, we have some problems here that maybe we should address first before we're giving all this assistance or aid. So, yeah.
The point, I had a different question entirely, but the point you just made, I think, is an extremely important point, because aid designed well creates stability, and it creates education, and probably leads toward democracy and education of women, all that other kind of thing. So good stuff. But anyway, my question was, is there a perception among the Southeast Asian nations that authoritarianism, military coup in Myanmar is going to lead it to becoming a puppet in China, with China, whether that becomes another one of the issues that back in the 60s, we called the domino effect, that China will then go after somebody else.
Yeah.
And then kind of a corollary question is, Australia is not part of this. And I'm wondering, is there no advantage to them to be part of it?
Great question. Yeah. So the first point of good things do go together. I'm so thankful of that as a social scientist to see that, no, it's not just wishful thinking that these good things go together. It's actually true. Right. So the countries say where there's more gender parity, tend to be democratic, tend to be low in corruption, tend to be non-violent in terms of their foreign policy. They're less likely to go to war, these places. They're less likely to have crime and violence domestically. So all these good things, education, healthcare, all the democracy, human rights, all those good things go together. They're in a package. So that's the good news there in terms of not having to make these difficult decisions and trade-offs. Yeah, we haven't heard much, or at least I haven't heard much of the rhetoric of the domino theory, but certainly the same logic is at play. And if countries around the world see, maybe in Thailand, they see, wow, this military coup in Myanmar, it kind of worked out for them. Then China assisted them. They came into the fold of China. Then they got, infrastructure assistance with the Belt and Road Initiative, and it worked out for them. Then Thailand's military might be more likely to say, maybe we should go down that path. So it's not really maybe tipping dominoes, but a demonstration effect. Right, that countries have demonstrated how this works, and then others may be more likely to follow that path. Yeah, Australia's role is obviously important here. And Australia's main interest in terms of Burma and Myanmar is China, right? And trying to limit and check the growing regional hegemony of China in the South Pacific, or in the Pacific region, and particularly in Southeast Asia. So President Biden has in many ways continued the policies of the Trump administration, and in certain ways has shifted in terms of foreign policy, but in significant ways has not been an abrupt shift, certainly not with, say, trade in China, trade and tariffs. We haven't seen a big shift from Trump to Biden. We've seen this kind of continuity. But one relatively big distinction that we can see is the promotion of international law and international organizations. So as President Biden, famously said, we're back. Right, we're back into the multilateral organizations and this agenda, this internationalist multilateral agenda. And so one of the elements of that, rejoining the Paris climate change deal, trying to get the Iran nuclear deal back going, working with these multilateral institutions. And one of the elements of this new doctrine, foreign policy approach, is the so-called Quad. Right, so the Quad is the group of 4 democratic nations of the region. So we have Japan and India and Australia and the United States. And the idea is that these 4 democracies, and powerful kind of big countries, democracies, we ought to be working together in concert. Maybe not a formal military alliance, but we're joining together in order to check or to balance the rising power of China. So Australia certainly has a role to play there, but Australia also has significant economic interests. And so it has economic interests in the region, and it doesn't want to forfeit or threaten those economic interests by taking a strong stand against the genocide in Myanmar or against China's repression of Uyghurs, Muslims in China, et cetera. So yeah, I think the role of Australia is central, and for the United States to try to work to not allow any distance between the US position and Australia's position, and also with the other members of the Quad, to have this united front in terms of dealing with the issues of the region, and particularly dealing with the issue of China. There is another question here, or? And it looks like we got about 5 more minutes. For the folks here in the room, I have a busy day, busy afternoon, but I will stick around for a little bit if we have additional questions that weren't addressed.
Back in the days of from the 70s to the 90s, and that I had heard about China supporting the building of our expressways from 94 and so forth. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so China's infrastructure project is huge, and it goes by different names, sometimes One Belt, One Road, but mostly we call it the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So we showed a map of the trading routes, but so China is building rails, building ports, building highways, not necessarily in North America, but primarily through Asia, connecting China to all these other trading hubs around the world. And so a country like Sri Lanka could say, we need a new deep water port. It will help our trade, help our economic advancement. So China will provide the financing for building that port, and then they will require that the Sri Lankans use Chinese firms to build the port using Chinese materials. And so that China is helping Sri Lanka in its economic development, but really China's promoting its own interests. And of course, through that infrastructure program, the Belt and Road, then we have kind of a problem of debt diplomacy. So these countries then are indebted to China to pay for this port eventually. And then if they fall into economic crisis, then China will say, okay, well, that port, it's ours. We actually own it if you can't pay the bills or pay back the loan for it. So again, just using an economic tool in terms of infrastructure to advance its own position of power regionally and perhaps globally. Yes, please.
Well, I actually have 2, and you can pick your choice. One, what about the warfare or the future of Christianity and Islam? And also in terms of, were you surprised that climate change was not in that 9-point priority list at the beginning of the slides?
Yeah, right. Yeah, but it was interesting that the issue about climate change, because then when the professor put up kind of, these are the existential threats, these are high politics, these are low politics, democracy and human rights at the bottom. But at the top in that existential group, he did put climate change as being this potentially existential threat, but then it's not included appropriately, at least consistently with that. The other thing I would say about the religious differences abroad, one thing that gives me comfort is, and of course it's an issue. The Rohingya are targeted in part because of their Muslim faith. The Uyghurs in China are targeted in part because of their Muslim faith. But I am encouraged that the 3 largest democracies in the world, turnout was really, we set a record in the United States. So we're now back to being the 2nd largest democracy in the world. For a while, we were the 3rd largest democracy in the world because folks in Indonesia are more likely to vote than folks in the US. So we have a bigger population, but they have bigger elections because the turnout was higher. But we took back our 2nd place. But it encourages me to think that the 3 largest democracies in the world, India, of course, a Hindu majority country. The United States, a Christian, at least for a little bit now, for a couple more years at least, a Christian majority country by the numbers, and then Indonesia, of course, a Muslim majority country. And so that is encouraging in terms of it's not culturally specific. It's not democracy only works in the West, or it only works for certain civilizations or certain cultural types, but it seems to be compatible across civilizations or differences of culture, including differences of religion.
Okay. Would you like to thank him for his presentation today?
Thank you all.
Thank you very
Great
much, Joel.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. We appreciate it. And thank you for coming, and thank you, Zoomers, for staying with us. It's a busy week for HASP, so I assume many of you will be back here tomorrow. See ya.